Hello guys, welcome to this video. In this video, I will react to a video done by Channels TV. Channels TV is a TV station in Nigeria, and this is their YouTube channel. I'm reacting to this video, which they call Nigerian British author discusses his recent book, A Slave Ship Called Jesus. So in this video, they interviewed the author of this book. So the interviewee is one of these people that I call intellectual frauds. They blame the problems of Africans solely on the white man and of course Christianity, but never blame the blacks. They never blame the black people who are the main sources of the problems, or let's say our problems. Of course, from my accent, you will quickly understand that I am a black man from Africa. And in fact, I live in Africa, I don't live in the West. The difference between I and these intellectual frauds is that, or the intellectual frauds is that I am among the few Africans that know the real source of our problems. Our poverty, our misery, and underdevelopment, you name it. In his book, Jesus of Lubeck, the fraud is trying to say that Christianity is a force for evil, and the force for evil against Africans, simply because some elite Europeans who engaged in transatlantic slave trade named their ships with words or phrases that has one connection or the other with to the Bible or Christianity, please. But he forgot that Christianity superseded these people for hundreds of years. Transatlantic slave trade happened just after the discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus in the 5th century, while Christianity has been very much around since the 1st century. We are talking about a gap of over 1,500 years. Let's hear him. Let's hear what he has to say.
You will fall, you will stumble, you will collapse, which is what has been happening. So we've got to retrace our steps. And that means understanding the genesis of this Nigeria story. Not even from 1900, you've got to take it from the roots. And so that is the exercise that I've taken upon myself to say, help our people to understand it. Others will come with the solution. I think I've got part of the solution.
If we are to go back, as this man said, we must go all the way back, not just stopping at some point. We must go all the way back to the Roman Empire at least. All right? Now let's continue.
But a real solution will be implemented by others. But the void, which is the understanding, especially in a country where they decided not to teach history. And
the reason why they don't teach history in Nigeria has nothing to do with, be it from the, let's say, because of the white man or colonialism maybe, but the main reason is the fact that there was a war in Nigeria that is called Nigerian Biafran War. It is actually a genocidal war against the Biafrans when they decided to quit Nigeria for very good reasons, because you can't call yourself a member of the country and you're a citizen of the country and you get treated like second-class citizen. Your people get killed like flies, massacred like fowls. They had very good reason to quit, to say that they're no longer interested in being called Nigerians. But the Nigerians refused and even killed more of the Biafran. And it is the shame of that thing or that event or that evil that happened against fellow Africans. That's why I keep on saying that the problems of Africans are Africans themselves. Nigeria decides not to teach history simply because they are trying to hide a part of their history, that the genocides they committed against fellow black people. That is why they don't teach history in Nigeria. So you don't ask questions. If you don't know, how will you ask questions? It's not a must that you will know everything, at least, but at least you have an idea. And it's that idea that you want to know everything now that begins that pushes you to ask questions. They don't want you to ask questions. They don't want anybody to ask questions. Therefore, no history. Nobody talks about it anymore. That is the deal. Don't listen to this guy. He's just lying to you.
We're almost like, in the context of history, we're like free-range chicken. whatever you find is what you consume. So as a result, there's a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of gossip, there's a lot of beer parlor gist, rather than structured learning. And if we can all get onto the same page in terms of the understanding, then the solution becomes so much easier.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to talk about that. But since our focus is primarily on this, your new book, with a very interesting title, A Slave Ship Called Jesus. You know, when I first saw this book and I considered us featuring it, I said, I hope I won't get in trouble with viewers. I mean, considering, of course, for obvious reasons.
It is hard-hitting.
Yeah, a slave ship called Jesus. Why this title and what motivated this book? I would like you to introduce it to viewers and then we dig in.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the title is concerned, I was just minding my own business. I was just, as any educated African should, seeking to teach myself.
You mean intellectual fraud? Because that's what many of you are, all these so-called educated people. You're just frauds. All right?
About what happened in that trade. What was it all about? How did it start?
By trade, you mean
the slave trade?
Transatlantic slave
trade. The transatlantic slave trade. How did it start? What was going on? And it's in the course of research that you come across certain factual details. And finding that one of the ships was called Amazing Grace. Another one was called a slave ship. It was called, the Jesus of Lubeck. Now that hit me hard. Given that I was raised in a Christian setting, I was struck by the fact that this evil trade, this where you ship people out of their continents, you wrench them out of their environment, you shove them into the boat, chain them down, you sail them across the oceans onto these plantations where they're often worked to death systematically. And these ships can be called the Jesus of Lubeck, religious names. And
I am not in any way denying that some people thought it best to name their ship using phrases like Amazing Grace or Jesus of Lubeck or some other names that they could come up with. But condemning Christianity because of this is like condemning, let's say, Islam because of the activities of some nut job who has an Islamic name, that he engaged in a terror act, and in the process unalived many people. We cannot condemn the idea of Islam solely based on that fact. Instead, we go into the holy books or the manuals of the ideology to check what the ideology or religion has to say about such activities. Is that act condoned or condemned by the books of that religion? Anything you do outside the religion means that you may be professing that religion, but you're just a freaking hypocrite. We cannot condemn Islam based on the actions of the hypocritical Muslims. So we cannot condemn Christianity based on the actions or inactions, by the way, of the hypocritical Christians or hypocritical people who call themselves Christians. What does the Bible really say about kidnapping? The Bible says it clearly that a man that kidnaps another person, that is the kidnapper, must be stoned to death. It is a capital offense. So if a person that calls himself a Christian kidnaps someone using any means possible, or a sheep he called Jesus, how then can you say that it is Christianity that is behind it or that pushed him into such a wicked activity? The name Jesus has been known for at least 1,600 years before that sheep called Jesus of Lubeck ever existed. Let's bear that in mind. All right? Anyway, let's continue.
What's especially when you consider that this was a time when Christianity was very strong in Europe, such that attendance in church was compulsory. It's not like now they don't go to church. It's our people who are all running to the church. They don't go. But then,
And at the time,
their
if you don't attend church, you're gonna be killed. You're gonna be unalived. You'll be executed.
approach to church was as our approach is now. And just imagine us in this era, assuming the trade never happened, and assuming we were the ones going to initiate the trade.
Again, this intellectual fraud of a man forgot that back then, as I said earlier, it is forbidden not to attend church. Another thing is that the church forbade people from owning Bibles in their homes. So they forced people to go to church to get indoctrinated with state propaganda. If you are caught with a copy of the Bible in your home, you will be burnt at stake. You will be executed, or some other way. They have examples. You have Google. Why is it like that? Why did the church force people to the higher members of the church force people to go to church back in the days? It is simply because the elites did not want the plebs to know the truth. Does the Bible condemn or condone this rat act? Yes, the Bible condemns it, which is why the rulers did not want the rule to have the Bible and know the truth. It's very simple.
And the ship, we say, is going to be called the Jesus of Lubeck, the grace of God. How does that happen?
So ships used to take human cargoes from here to the Americas and so on were labeled Grace of God, and then of course Jesus of Lubeck.
Yeah.
That's where your title.
That's where they gave
I
me.
thank the interviewer for using the word labeled, because that's just what it is. They just labeled their ship or whatever name they wanted. Will anybody can anybody stop them from doing that? No. I can for example, it's like me having a car today, and I can call the car anything I want. Nobody can stop me.
Me the title. They gave me the title.
Interesting. We'll dig into this. I mean, we don't have so much time, but we'll try. Do you think that not enough is known about our slave trade history? And what's the danger of this ignorance?
We certainly do not know enough about this very vital period in our existence. This was 3 centuries. This was the 1600s to the late 1800s.
About 400 years.
About 400 years. That is a huge chunk of one's civilized existence not to know anything about. And in contrast, China, who we try to say we want to aspire to be, they are so versed in their history. Every aspect of
Chinese.
Yes, the Chinese. Every aspect of their history. They have a concept called the 100 years of national humiliation. So they soak themselves in the understanding and knowledge of what happened, because that's a key part to how you got to where you are. But if we say it all happened a long time ago, it means that the events that happened then, we're not able to recognize them in our present. So for example, much of our setting now, the kind of governance that we have, is not wholly dissimilar to plantation life, where you had overseers over the enslaved unfortunates, laboring in the fields in all sorts of inhumane conditions, and then the overseers sat above them, punishing them accordingly, and they were rewarded because the overseers were just like the managers on the ground. The owners will be back home in England, back home in America, back home in Europe. So you see that relationship, you could almost transpose it to what we have now in terms of what we call governance. And that's because we haven't studied the past. We can't recognize that in reality, what we call democracy today is almost like plantation. It's just slights.
Fantastic. But then, how does this invalidate the message of Christianity? That is what I'm looking for. In the plantations, the slaves were prevented from knowing how to read and write. So they don't read and write the Bible today, and the very next day, they're asking for freedom. You get it? They don't want them to learn how to read and write so that they don't read, they do not, one day, out of the blue, one day they read the Bible, the very next day, out of the blue, they start asking for their freedom, because definitely they're going to get a lot of information from the Bible that makes it morally wrong, religiously wrong for somebody who calls himself a Christian to kidnap somebody, sell him to slavery, and put him to work for free. There's no such thing in the Bible as in go and get somebody, and especially somebody that is black, is not the same color as you, and you enslave him. There is no such thing anywhere. Despite what these people, all these intellectual frauds are talking about, they want to enforce it to make, oh no, this is how it happened. The Christianity is bad. Christianity does this. Christianity promotes that. It's evil and all that nonsense they are talking about. Anyway, let's hear him. It's not yet the end of the video.
Redecoration, but substantively much the same.
Interesting. A slave ship called Jesus is basically the story of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yes.
In many ways.
Yes.
I would like you to, is that correct? Would you like to elaborate a bit on what this book is about?
It is essentially a study of the trade, but with particular reference to faith, with particular reference to Christianity, the church in relation to that trade, especially when people understand that the trade was conducted under license from the head of the church, the Pope, as it then was, until England now.
He's talking about the same Pope that banned the ordinary people from owning Bible in their homes. Let's not forget that.
Initially, England was not party to that trade. They became the league champions.
It was initially Spain.
It was initially Spain and Portugal.
And Portugal,
because Spain was the lead Catholic country. And you could only get into the trade under license from the Pope.
So he gave licenses for people to come to this part of the world, take people, and then go and sell.
Yes.
So basically, it was a business.
It was
that needed licensing.
It was a commercial.
Those people did a lot of evil things, by the way. They did a lot of evil things in contravention to the commandments of the Bible. So, are we then going to condemn the Bible because some people who say they are Christians did evil things? No. The answer is no. Because it is clear that the Bible condemns what they did. It's very simple. Anyway.
Enterprise, it was controlled, and the book explains how the British now got into the trade, which was the creation of the Church of England. When Henry needed his divorce.
Henry the Seventh?
Henry the Eighth. He needed his divorce from the daughter of the King of Spain, because Spain was like America today, the enforcer, the global enforcer. There was no way the Pope was going to approve that divorce. So what did Henry do? He did what I call the original Brexit, the first Brexit. He declared, I'm leaving, and I'm leaving with my people. I'm leaving the Catholic fold. I'm setting up my own church. He made himself the head of the church and granted himself his divorce.
And remarried.
And remarried. And that now freed England to enter the trade. And it was actually his daughter.
Yeah, because English businessmen, let's call them that now, suddenly found out that they did not need the approval or the license of the Pope.
Correct.
To get into the business of slave trade, right?
Correct.
Is that correct?
Absolutely.
So it's sort of like opened the market.
It opened the markets. That move of taking themselves out meant, just like the recent Brexit, whilst they were within Europe, they were bound by the rules of European trade, etc. By the Brexit that we all followed, the debates around, etc. They now free themselves to make whatever trade deals they want. Similarly, in that original religious Brexit, where they pulled themselves out of the Catholic fold, set up their own church. They were now free to go in and do what they like. And the profits were so huge that they couldn't simply stand aside. And so that's when the ship that was owned by the royal family, it was
Queen Elizabeth I.
Queen Elizabeth I. She had inherited the ship from her father, King Henry VIII, and she now chartered that ship to the slave trade.
John Hawkins.
To John Hawkins.
And his family.
Did you notice another dishonesty? You see, Queen Elizabeth I inherited, according to what he said, inherited the ship from who? Her father. Which means the ship was already in service. It was already in use for purposes other than transporting human cargo, right? Now, the question is, why were, why were these ships named using religious words or, religious phrases? You see, at the time, there were no GPS. The navigation equipments of the time were crude at best. It was difficult to avoid dangerous storms on the high seas. The news of sailors and their crew losing their lives on the high seas due to bad weather or other things were very frequent. So they relied on superstition. They were superstitious people. They were superstitious people. They gave their ships religious names because they believed that it would bring them protection from quote and unquote marine spirits who were constantly attacking them. Funny, right? But this is how it was back then. Another reason is sorry. Another reason is, will the Spaniards, the most Catholic of the Catholics at the time, attack a ship called Jesus? Will they? Well, of course they did. They did. And they captured that ship and sold it for scraps. All right? That's what happened to the ship they called Jesus of Lubeck. All right? So, don't let this guy deceive you. Anyway, let's hear him out.
I mean, viewers who probably have not read this, the Jesus of Lubeck ship, which
Yes.
he named this book after, was owned by Queen Elizabeth I.
Correct.
Right? Queen Elizabeth I gave it to John Hawkins, the slave trader, for business.
Yes.
And then the profits from it was shared.
Yes.
So the Queen made a lot of money.
It was her contribution to the business, like any business.
Investment.
Yes, an investment. That's my contribution to the capital with which we're going to trade.
So we don't have enough time to discuss this because it's my head is just spinning. I mean, when I was reading your book, I've read it once. Now I'm going to read it 2 more times. I promised myself that because there's no way you can grasp all this from one reading. It was, I mean, at the risk of repeating what we said, it was a structured, organized business.
Absolutely.
Sanctioned by the government of England.
Absolutely. Correct.
And the government of England, which was also at that point in time, more or less synergized with the Church of England.
Yes.
Basically.
Indeed. Indeed.
So,
Indeed. And this is very important for our people to understand because, we often get caught up in a conversation. People say, we were selling our own people.
Yeah,
now,
that's another thing.
It is so important to understand that this was a structured enterprise. It wasn't, I want people to understand, it wasn't as if we here had for sale signs over our people.
Maybe they did. Maybe they did, because the Africans were putting other Africans in cages at the in the coastal areas of Africa. So what is this guy talking about? Is that not a kind of for sale sign? Why do you put them in cages? Come on, man. Who are you trying to deceive?
They came initially. The first boatload that Hawkins got, he kidnapped them. Off the
About
coast,
300.
a whole
slaves.
boatload, 300 slaves,
Yeah.
300 people.
People.
We were now enslaved, and he now sailed off with them.
Wow. I don't know for this John Hopkins. Of course, there is John Hopkins that, I mean, the guy called John Hopkins existed. But I don't know exactly how John Hopkins started. That is why I said earlier that it is important that we go as far back as the days of the Roman Empire. Because even before then, the other slave trade that involves Africans was already going on. That is I'm talking about the Arab slave trade, which was later controlled by the then Islamic power, and by that I mean the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire. After the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus, the transatlantic slave trade started, but the slave dealers initially wanted slaves from India. The quickest way to go to India was by land. From Europe, you go into Asia, but you must pass through Asia Minor, which is today's Turkey, which was under the Ottoman Empire rule. The Ottomans will never have allowed that to happen without heavy taxation. Remember, the Ottomans were already doing the slave trade themselves. They traded everyone, blacks, whites, Asians, you name it. Depending on the type of person or what you want to use the slave for. The Ottomans for example, they used the white women for sexual pleasures. The others were mainly used for labor, for example, the farms and all that. So the Europeans, I also know about I think the Janissaries or something, Janissaries, the military, the main military of the Ottoman Empire. So these were people they kidnapped, mainly from Africa. So the Europeans, of course, they did kidnap a lot of white people. They did a lot of kidnapping in Europe. So everybody was, as I said earlier, everybody was involved. All right, everybody were their victims. So the Europeans wanted the slaves for labor. Since the American Indian tribes cannot be used as such simply because they tended to run away. It is their land, so they knew the terrain very well. They knew the ins and outs in every nook and cranny of the area, so they could just simply disappear into nature. That is why they decided, that is the white people decided, not just white people, by the way, not just white people, black people were also involved. I know of a guy called Anthony Johnson. Anyway, they knew they wanted people who didn't know anything about the area or the Americas. So they used the ship, sailed down to the coast of Southern Africa, where they sold, they were sold slaves. Slaves were sold to them by who? The Africans. Those were prisoners of war. I think the people he's talking about, those were prisoners of war, intertribal war between, or intertribal wars between African kingdoms. That was how the transatlantic slave trade was born. The notion that the Europeans were guns blazing into Africa, hunting people is a pure lie. This is why he completely made it up. It was impossible for the Europeans to get beyond the coast because the mosquitoes were their greatest enemies. The few that did manage to venture into certain areas, they died of malaria, which by then there was no cure. The European style of it. Of course, the Africans I'm an African, I'm an Igbo man. We know we have our own way of curing malaria, of treating malaria and getting rid of it from somebody's organisms. But the Europeans, they didn't. So they had no cure, they had no immunity to malaria. So because of that, they died like flies. By the time the cure of malaria, the European style of cure of malaria was invented, the Atlantic slave trade had been abolished. it had been abolished. Don't listen to this guy. He's lying to you, man. This guy you see here, this guy, he's just a liar.
And sold them in Haiti.
Yeah.
And it was the profits from that. They were so huge. They now convinced them that this was the way to go. So more and more ships were now diverted into that trade. And now it became more sophisticated because the coastal peoples now became wary. Whenever the ships were coming in, they would run further inland. But some of the ones that they had taken away, as always, there will be some who would be good workers.
Mhm.
Some of those will be co-opted. They now have the language, they can go in and speak to the peoples, and they were sent in to reassure the coastal peoples that we're not after you. We're not going to touch you. Work with us. Here are the guns.
Gin, rum,
Gin,
and all that.
guns.
So you argue that, this thing about, our people, if our people had not been involved in selling their own brothers, nothing would have happened. So you argue that that's not accurate.
Yes.
You argue that they were manipulated, right?
Funny.
They were coerced
Funny,
to
right?
get into the business.
Absolutely.
That's your argument.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a nonsense narrative that was spun that we ran with because we had not done our own research. Well, what became interesting was that when abolition came,
This is what I call a fraud, man. The fraud. Oh my God.
and the book explains the real reasons for abolition, that it wasn't a change of hearts, it was a change of thinking. And it was a change of thinking forced upon the slavers by the Africans who had revolted, in particular in Haiti. It was the Haitian Revolution that now made it clear that they can't sustain the trade any longer. And that's when they started thinking of abolition. And in the course of the abolition debates,
This is pure fallacy. Even during the heydays of this is difficult to pronounce. The heydays of the transatlantic slave trade, a lot of white people sternly opposed it with every fiber in their body. But unfortunately, these people had no political power. All right? They had no political power. They used the Bible to argue against slave trade, that anyone who calls himself a Christian cannot be involved in such a business. They were persecuted, they were hunted, they are wild animals, they were killed, they were imprisoned, they were exiled, a lot of things. The Haitian Revolution that he's talking about, yes, played a key role, but to say that it was the Africans that made that made the Europeans to stop slave trading that is complete false. That is a false narrative that he generated in his head. After all, the country that was in control of Haiti at the time is France. But the first European country to abolish slave trade is the very England he is foaming the mouth about. So do not I keep on saying it, do not allow these intellectual frauds to deceive you. Continue.
because they didn't, those who were profiting from the system, because any political system has winners and losers. Those who were profiting from the system weren't going to roll over and say, you take my daily bread away. They were resisting, they were holding on. And so the arguments in Parliament were actually very revealing. One side arguing that it's evil, it's got to go, etc. The other one says, no, 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 no.
Yeah, those were white people saying that. So now you see how he contradicted himself.
We need it, it must continue, etc. And in the course of those exchanges, evidence spills out as to how the trade was really being instigated. And I remember one of the prime ministers who said that it is we who are instigating the trade. It is we who have the demand. It is we who supply the weapons for them to go and fight other groups and capture them, and in order to supply.
So you
our
mean
needs.
if I give you a pew and tell you to unalive yourself, you will? In fact, if your fellow man was able to manipulate you into doing such an evil act to your brother, it means that something is seriously wrong with you. something is seriously wrong with you. That one can never be overemphasized. That something is seriously wrong with you. Huh? I mean, the black man literally became his own brother's worst enemy. I mean, how do I put it again? We see many of them today. They are still very much around. With brothers like these, why would I need an enemy? No, I don't need an enemy, because this guy, oh my God, the guy is already a huge enemy to me. So frustrating, man.
There are so many angles to your...
And many lies too.
Look, I really enjoyed reading your book.
I'm glad.
I mean, because I love history, you know. There are so many angles. Catholicism, Protestantism, there's that angle of a lot of us don't realize that these two religious concepts, faiths, I don't know, faith, that's a faith, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. That they are, sorry, just on a light note, just now that they were interwoven with the politics.
Oh, yes.
Of those days.
Yes.
There was no difference between states and religion at a point in time. That happened later on.
Yes.
Particularly in England. But they were interwoven. And so
will Mr. Intellectual Fraud say that it was black people that made it happen? That is the separation of church and state. Will he argue it's the black people that made that made it possible? It was the same English, the English white man that made it happen. You see, mixing church and state is even condemned in the Bible, especially in the Bible. I mean the Old Testament, not just the New Testament. Yeah, it is you find out it's outrightly condemned. But even in the Old Testament, it is there that you don't mix the church and the state. A good example is a king called Uzziah. He tried to mix his statutory duties as a king with the duties of the priesthood. What did God do about it? God punished him with leprosy. I think it's leprosy, right? I believe it's leprosy or something very how do you pronounce that? Debilitating. So please stop listening to frauds. Analyze what they say and back it. Do your own your own research. All right. Don't listen to idiots. Anyway, let me end this video here. It's getting too long. All right. Thank you so much, guys, for listening to me, for making out the time to listen to me. It's a very interesting thing about this Jesus of Lubeck sheep. Anyway, I want you to go and do your own research. Do not take any of my words for it. Do your own research. All right. Thank you so much. Goodbye. See you next time. Please like the video if you do. Share it to your people, to your friends and all that. All right. Goodbye.